Okay. So we're calling this Exile at Home because, all of us at this moment are kind of exiled from our professional and creative lives in some important ways. And we, in a way, are also exiled at home. We are actually in our home. And I think about Jewish tradition and Jewish culture where, exile has been a fundamental part of the texture of Jewish life. But by the same token, there's been this idea of the text that has come with us. The text has kind of been our homeland, and Jews have lived within and through text all this time. So there's been a sense where the writers and or ritualists and or poets throughout Jewish history have somehow created a home for the communities they've been a part of. And so there's this interesting way that when we are in these liminal spaces, in this kind of exile, there is something apropos of artists and writers helping us hold this space. And I was also thinking just about Passover, how Passover is this moment of time when the Jews and the Israelites were in this liminal space, this exile between Egypt and the Promised Land. And I think about how Miriam, when the Jews got across the Sea of Reeds, she was the one who created the first artistic experience, collective experience through music and dance. And it seems to me in a way that the first experience of the Jews, the Israelites as a free people was an artistic one. So another reason to think about the value of our artists in moments like this. Okay. I'm going to quickly introduce our two speakers. Alphabetically, Dan Alter is a Berkeley-based poet. His poems have appeared in many excellent publications, including Ziziva and Field. His first full-length book of poems, My Little Book of Exiles, is forthcoming soon from Eyewear Press in London. Welcome, Dan, to the show. Okay, next up, Sophie Herxheimer. Sophie is a prolific, multidimensional artist and poet. Among many other things, she teaches at the Royal Drawing School in London. And London is full of her sculptural interventions. She's also written a number of books of poetry. Many of them feature her own artwork. The most recent book of hers is 60 Lovers to Make and Do. You have a copy of that, Sophie? We'll take a look.
It's full of Post-it notes.
And over the course of our conversation, we'll have a chance for Sophie to actually show some art as part of this. And I guess I should say, okay, so let's do this. I wanted to start with a question. This question is for everybody, our two poet guests, as well as everyone on the call. And the question is, where do you find yourselves? And I mean this literally in the sense that it's interesting to know where people are, where in their homes and where their homes are located, but also there's a kind of an existential thing, like where do we find ourselves in this moment in time? So I encourage folks just to, in the chat, just to say, hello, I'm X from Y. I'd be really curious to see where people are checking in from. And also for our two poets, Dan and Sophie, like, where are you right now?
I'll start then. I'm in this fantastic studio space in Berkeley, which is a real surprise to me, but I'm getting used to it because I've been given this fantastic residency and opportunity by a nonprofit called Working Assumptions and by Asylum Arts to have some time away from my family and my usual commitments to really concentrate on developing my painting practice, my art practice, my poetry, everything. And it's strange how coronavirus and the other things have kind of turned my question marks about solitude around a bit.
And this is, behind you is one of your paintings. And
yes, I've made myself a little set out of, by sitting in front of one of my very big, long paintings, which I can sort of travel along a little bit that way. And you can see it's quite a big painting.
Yeah, good. And at the end, I hope we'll have a chance to do maybe a quick virtual tour of your set, of your studio. Sophie, much more from you in just a moment. Dan Alter, where are you?
I'm in our little, we call it a shed, in our backyard in Berkeley. And isn't this so interesting, adapting when all these dizzying days of adapting to new conditions, here we are adapting to a literary event in a kind of aggregated set of privacies. And so this is a space that I'm always alone in, almost always. And my wife and daughter texted that I should pull the curtain so that I wouldn't be totally backlit. But I do have, it says where I write, and there are books, and there's a garden outside.
Great, thank you. And I was thinking how, in this moment we are, exiled from the places that we usually create our social worlds from, but we are in some ways, as artists, in our actual writing homes. And so it seems like with Dan and Sophie, you both are, despite all the difficulties of this time, in a way you're both home.
It's a very conceptual home. It's
all
not.
Right.
But yeah.
And I'm just going to say that I see that people are calling in from all over the world, England and Canada, New York, Los Angeles, everywhere near the Bay Area. So thank everyone for joining us. We're going to jump into some poems. So we have structured 3 sets of poems that Sophie and Dan will share. And I believe we decided in the end, Sophie, you were going to start with 2 poems from your book, Welcome to Inkland.
Yeah, I could do that. This is Welcome to Inkland. And it came out in 2017, and it's a book in which I've really channeled the voice of my long dead grandmother, who came to England as a refugee in 1938. And the first poem in the book is the first one I'll read, and then I'll read one from later in the book, and that'll be my beginning. And they're written phonetically in her accent, which makes them kind of less about acting and more about inhabiting. And you'll see that the phonetics influence how I read them. I just read them as straight as possible. London. Not so many days since we're arriving. This grey is like Berlin, the same grey day we have. This northern weather on the damp street. A bit of rain won't hurt, will help the trees on this Hampstead Heath we see in fact. Why should I mind that? I drive with the buses. Herr Conductor asking me, for what? I don't exactly remember. Fast, please? To him my penny I hand over. He nods with a kind smile. Thanks, love, he says. Oh, I am his love. Turns handle on machine, out curls the ticket. This is when I know that here to settle is okay. The city will be home, where even on the bus is love. And then straight to one which I've imagined that she's written from her afterlife. Not that we have one, us Jews, but we go somewhere, I guess. And in this case, the people in question have gone into some knitwear, their spirits. And this is a piece of real knitwear that my daughter used to wear and now is being worn by somebody even smaller. And you'll hear about this piece of knitwear. Wash by hand, learn by heart. The youngest of my great-great-grandchildren is lining up her dolls and bears for class. When they slump in ragged exhaustion, she arranges them to lean on the cupboard. Sit up straight, she commands. If any one of you knows the answer, don't shout out, put up your hand. The sweater that this teacher wears looks oddly familiar. The one Aunt Friede sent from Vienna for my girl when she was small. I see, the wool still has some bounce and amazingly no moss holes. Funny, Friede always said she didn't like to knit. I haven't the patience. She lied. This sweater has an intricate pattern of blue squares raised in a ridge of a nice white stocking stitch. I marveled at it then, when it arrived springing like a lamb from stiff brown paper. Within weeks of that, Friede, like so many, was seized, imprisoned, murdered. Now this enduring labor of hers is worn as kind of woolen uniform, commanding all who are born or even stuffed. Make things up, play.
Thank you, Sophie. Hey, I might mix it up already a little bit. I hope that's okay with my poet friends. Dan, before you read, do you have any response to kind of Sophie's poems? The two of you have really just met and are just getting to know each other's work. And I'm curious what your initial response is to how this work strikes you.
Well, the thing that's so compelling about those poems is that they're in they go sort of one full step beyond our kind of the realm of persona poems, and they're kind of the people's voice takes her voice over, and we just hear these voices, and so that, I mean, that's the main thing I'm struck by, is that there's this kind of full conduit of these people coming in through those poems.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'm also wondering in this context, I mean, I know that when I first saw the poems from this collection, that I was struck by the phonetics of it. That is, it's kind of English, it's kind of German. And as I said to Sophie when I first read it, I felt like a foreigner in my own language. There's something really disorienting about that, but disorienting in the way that poetry, I think, works. It helps us take a step back and look at our life and consciousness differently through the application of language in different ways.
But
I think language in exile is a strange thing to consider, because when in exile, people are forced into holding on to little bits of their language and also assimilating into the language of the new place. And I've noticed that even being in America, that I'm taking on some of the terminology and I'm leaving some of it, and I'm laughing at some of it and intrigued. And I read a beautiful book called Translation as Transhumans by Mireille Gansel, who's a wonderful translator. And she made me reread Welcome to England in a different light when I'd read that, because she talked so much about what we preserve and what we discard in terms of our language when we're in a new place. And that reflected back on what I had done by trying to bring my granny back into the London that I knew her in, and also place her back in the Berlin and the Leipzig that she had come from, which was revealed every time she opened her mouth. So it's a game of displacement that has as much sadness in it as it does humor, like most games of anything.
Sophie, what was the last line of the first poem? Even there's love even on the bus. What was that?
Yeah, it's because that was based on a true story, and she really did tell me that she was so freaked out when the bus conductor called her love, which is a very English way of speaking.
But say the line again, would you?
The city, this is when I know that here to settle is okay. The city will be home, where even on the bus is love.
Right, that's just right, I think. So that's the other thing I wanted to say as a comment, is that that the home and exile are these constantly, I think for us, are these constantly shifting categories, and that's just so right about that. I'll settle here because even on the that anyway, it's not much
for me on this bus.
worth calling out.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I always feel very at home on a bus, I must admit, except in these days, strangely.
Dan, do you want to transition, and can you read us the poem that you were going to start with, and just say a little bit more, if you want, about the context of the group of poems that you are going to be reading today?
Sure. Well, let's see. I'll say, so I wrote a series of poems in a form called a ghazal. It's a Persian form that has a lot of strict rules that allow you to kind of string couplets together that have some formal connection, but then they can otherwise move very loosely between one another. And when I was done with them, I felt like even that was too tight for me, so I tore apart some of the formal constraints. But these are sort of echoes of ghazals, the two of them that I'm going to read today. And I'm also taking advantage of this new technological situation to, I think I'm reading from my screen, but I'm hoping that it will actually mean that it's as if I'm looking at you. So you out there, friends and dear ones. Traces. Then I was mostly scared, and mostly the house was spiders stringing seasons into fog through which sometimes a record played, someone singing. My father's father went door to door the rest of his life, selling brushes, hearing no Romanian. He wore out his ears with roar of his Buick. The Danube River Delta, black-crowned night heron, gray-lag goose, white pelican, 320 species of birds I can Google, but what use is a grandfather I met 2 or 3 times. The traces make the sound of dust, one mind by itself, wind in leaves and litter, violins in complete dark of their cases, houses left alone have come through into daylight, carrying air left empty or used up. Okay.
Thank you. So I have kind of a whole kind of constellation of responses to this and other poems by Dan. But Sophie, I wanted to also, if there were an opportunity for you to respond to something specific in the poem, any piece of language or any of the
I love the musicality of the poem, and I love the fact that you only really come to those violins in their darkened cases towards the end, when you've had his ears being kind of sort of worn out by the roar of his Buick. I like the repeats and the rhythm of it. I like door to door and Buick, and there's a lot of little internal rhyming that I'm just beginning to hear. I mean, I've heard that now before, and so my ear is beginning to go into the spaces of the poem more than when I heard it the first time. I loved it actually the first time I heard it. I like the idea of the spider at the beginning, and there's something haunting and there's movement in it that isn't particularly tangible. So a lot of the movement in it is to do with the sound moving across the page, like a bird or an invisible grandfather, the ghost of a grandfather. I like also that contrast between the literal and the Googleable birds and the ungoogleable spirit. I feel that that's encapsulated somehow. That's what the poem holds. So I like its atmosphere, and it has it has a sort of sense of loss, but not. But the images are very present, which is a great thing you can do in a poem, is to have these images that hold, whilst at the same time have the whole thing permeated with a sense of loss and the atmosphere of what might have been or what was and what's gone.
Well, shall we go deeper into loss, and I'll read the next one?
Why don't we?
If everyone can, stick with it, I think we'll be rewarded. Yeah.
Dan, you probably can't track the chats, but someone was hoping that they could hear the poems again.
I just saw that also. That's right.
Yeah. Time for that, but
yeah, it's an interesting question. In the best of all possible worlds, at a poetry reading, you just buy the books and then you have them after.
We could put the text up on the chat. Anyway, I'll read the poem and you ponder that.
Okay. But yeah, thank you for that question.
Okay. let's see. So the next poem, the second poem I'm going to read is called The Fog Over Ashkenaz. Fog Over Ashkenaz. And maybe I'll just say by introducing this that when I was working on these poems that are in the book, which I don't know if, did you mention this, Dan, that my book of poems that's coming out soon, supposed to be by the end of the year, but you know, who knows what we can plan on at this point, is called My Little Book of Exiles. And so you could say I wrote the book on exile. And I was really trying to write into this question of what my mind can make of the relationship to my ancestors and to where they lived, given what separates me from them and from those lands. So this is a poem about that. Fog over Ashkenaz. What covers where I come from? Ancestors' ground, a floating zone between countries called the Pale, or was that from the shade of their skin in Christian shadows? My father's eyes come from names I've tried to learn and lost. 1,100 years of sojourning can't be wrong, but my 4 grandparents among the lucky enough to leave before, the trouble I'm starting out in, a gap that widens. In the swallowing hole, was it all lost, or did their spirit filter to points the letters mark? A hole I'm looking into. Yiddish speakers in shade of black forests. Somewhere near, say, Vilna, their feet must have touched ground. Altar, meaning elder in Yiddish, which is sticky with 11th century German. What haven't you lost of their art? Fog is general all over Ashkenaz. In minutes, the shtetl names have drifted. Wouldn't I feel a whole lot better not rummaging for origins in that tight a crawl space? Still, 5 layers of shade make the skin paler than fog. Yes, it ended badly, but my father didn't get his blue eyes from nowhere. And I'll say my father and his blue eyes are somewhere on the gallery view, if you want to try and peek at them.
Sophie, any response to fog?
Again, I think I like the point that people are making on the chat that we could look at the text, and
yeah.
Because it is hard to, when you're listening to a poem, you're listening hard and you're tracking the images as they go by. And so what I'm left with is the father's blue eyes. And the bit at the beginning, I've drifted away from it. I loved the ending, actually, because I like the double negative effect of it. And I like the playfulness that I feel punctuates the poem of language that goes between a kind of Yiddish idea and an English idea and a movement, again, a bit like I was saying before about language in exile, where bits of it are the same and bits of it are different, and you're kind of looking at those. And I like the idea of rummaging and disappearings and what's lucky and what isn't lucky, getting somewhere or not getting somewhere. That's what we're all doing all day, isn't it? Getting somewhere and not getting somewhere. And yeah, I feel that the poem has that kind of reaching after something atmosphere, as if the things that you're reaching after really are tangible, which they're not. So that's also a quite poetic paradox, really, isn't it? That which I can relate to.
Dan?
The only way I can think of to share the text is screen sharing, and then that would sort of take over the space.
Yeah, I'll say that, without, I don't know if I'm avoiding the decision, but there's something meta about this conversation, because so much of what we've been talking about, in a way, in your work, is kind of the presence of absence and these kind of lost voices that still are never quite lost. They are kind of numinous, liminal. They're kind of like a fog over our civilization, and that when we read a poem, but we don't see it, it's kind of like the words are there, but they're also gone. They've kind of like been exiled in a way.
I like the idea of fog anyway, because everybody warned me about the fog here in the Bay Area. I haven't actually seen that much of it. I've seen a little bit of it. I haven't been in San Francisco early in the morning. But I get the feeling that fog is very much part of the culture here. And it certainly is part of a historical culture in London, because London pea soupers are very famous, but they're slightly before my time. So it's quite interesting that we're negotiating antique fogs as well as our own, mental fogs. I quite like the theme of it,
I will, can I tip my hand and say that I don't know if anyone caught the reference. Anyone catch the reference? Anyway, when I write, I have these echoes of the writing that I love in my head, and who hasn't had chills hearing the line at the end of Joyce's story, The Dead, where he says the snow is general all over Ireland.
Oh, yeah, beautiful, isn't it? Yeah.
And that my mind took that and translated it.
So I have a thought just in terms of this issue of like what's present and what's absence. So we had initially thought, Dan, that we would read and people would hear it because we thought it would be distracting to have the screen full of the text. We can still make that shift. One thing that we could do, Dan, for your next poem is to maybe share kind of with the gates. That one may lend itself to sharing because of the shifting of formats.
Great, we'll try it.
Maybe when you get to that, okay. And then Sophie, for the ones that you'll be doing soon with 60 Lovers, those I don't have shareable.
I need those. They're not visual poems in the same way that Welcome to England poems are visual.
So maybe sorry, Sophie. So maybe what we'll do is that we'll read some of these poems, and then I think that maybe for the ones at the end, we'll put those up for both of you, and we'll see how that feels.
Well, I mean, certainly the index cards are visual. Yeah. The blood and water isn't visual if we're going to do that. The poems from 60 Lovers are themselves not particularly visual, but they're accompanied by collages in which I found lovers, and I make pictures of the lovers, but they're lovers to be found in bedspreads or chandeliers cut out, and they're a whole different ball game. But to listen to them is a different matter. So I guess they haven't got such a lot to do with Exile, apart from that the lovers are entirely figments of the imagination that sort of become real, which relates them to ghosts and to ancestors and to all the people who live in our imagination. And this is it's a work of collective female imagination made by one person, me. And in this book, 60 Lovers to Make and Do, there are at least 65 women, all of whom are described by their profession at the outset. That's the title of each poem. And they make up lovers out of things they find lying around at home or at work. So I'll start with an archaeologist, because why not? She moulded a lover from mud and a fragment of smoky Roman glass. He was tougher than your modern bloke, and they marched into a shared future in a straight line in all weathers. He taught her Latin, and that's what they spoke at home. He laughed in the face of death and climate change. Amor vincit omnia, he said. Hey, I'm the proof. And here's a sous chef. She rustled up a lover from tahini, pomegranate molasses, a favourite page from Alice B. Toklas, and a squeeze of lemon. At the end of her shift, she'd give her a piggyback home, where they'd lick the accumulated sauces off each other's secret recipes, then lie as naked as dumplings in a steamer. And I don't know, I've marked a few. There's one here.
Dumplings are so truly naked, aren't they?
It's good. I like that. That is an A1 interruption. I guess they really are. And I think that a lot of what these poems have is, because they're like these very absurd collagists, fantasy lunacies in a way, they fit in very well with self-isolation. I'll say that for them, if we want a theme to stick them to. Okay, I'll do you two more little tiny ones here, and then we go on. Investment banker, at least this one concerns Exile to a point. Investment banker, she shuffled a lover from 200 euros and the smack of the Lido on an icy morning. He rose glowing from the water, with shoulders so wide, it took her half an hour to scan the full breadth of his manliness. You'll do, she said, clicking her teeth. I have no papers, he admitted. I'll sort that out, she beamed. I'm a genius at bureaucracy, and also I have access to funds. And then I'll end with the one that I started the book with when I started writing this series. I mean, once I start writing things, it's very hard to stop. And I thought I had a marker in it somewhere. So that's a good hope. Yes. So this is one, and it's partly because I was prompted by fairy tale, which is something I absolutely love. And a bit like you with the Joyce, you know, our influences are there, aren't they, in everything we write. So, confectioner. She sculpted a lover from marzipan, flipped the sign on the door from open to closed, stared long and hard at her handiwork, snuck 2 dainty bites from the back of his neck. The almond night fell about them like lace.
Thank you, Sophie. I had 2 thoughts. I think I'm riffing off of 2 things you actually said the other day about your own work when we were talking about, do these poems fit into the Exile at Home rubric? And one thing you said was that jokes seem to be the natural home of the Jew. It was interesting given the humor of these poems. And the other, I think you said a homeland is what we make of things.
Yeah, I guess that in everything we make, we're making a home. That's what I think I'm frantically doing when I'm painting and drawing and making poems. I'm making somewhere for myself to fit in, because fitting in is not easy. And I've certainly never really fitted in. And I found a lot of I mean, I've not particularly wanted to fit in, I guess, or have I? I don't know. It's hard to tell. It's been such a long journey. So, yes, I think we create a map of home by whacking through all the brambles that don't allow us to settle down. That could be a home inside poetry, a home inside jokes, a home inside whatever seems at last to become familiar by enough sitting in it, practicing it, being part of it. So if family and jokes are the way that you manage, then they become like cushions, don't they? Even if they're barbed cushions, which humor often is, you know, they're push me, pull you cushions of humor. Slightly a nightmare, but we persist.
Dan, any thoughts on either of those 2 questions to Sophie? I'm wondering how they feel for you and your work. Either about humor or about, like, you know, what we make our homeland out of what we see around us.
Well, absolutely. I'm just thinking about her poems. Is that the thing I have to share is that maybe the most important thing to go out on a limb about that's home is our relationships. That's really where we find our homes, is with each other, and those poems are about people basically shaping, you know, kind of creating the other that they want, and then devouring it, or, you know.
I mean, they're projections, aren't they? Which is what we're all involved with all the time in our real relationships and our imagined relationships and our, you know, deep and shallow relationships all around us. It's all this kind of frantic projecting, which I think art is too, you know, in another way.
And then, right, and then it also makes me think of the last poem that I'm going to read, which is about someone who's, you know, which is about speaks to this again about where home is really relationships.
Maybe this is a good transition for us to go to our third kind of cluster, our third and last cluster of poems that'll be reading. So I think we had that Sophie was going to read the two, and then Dan, you were going to clean up.
I'm only going to read one. I was going to read Blood and Water, wasn't I?
Okay. Yeah.
Wow.
Great. And then Sophie, offer us a little bit of context, please, for.
Okay, so this poem is part of a very new series that I'm working on in relation to my family history. And I'm working on it collaboratively with my cousin James, James Rolfe, he's a composer, and he's in Canada, and we're first cousins. And we went to Mainz and Frankfurt looking, well, on the trail of some of our ancestors, some of whom we knew because they came to England, and some who perished in the Holocaust, and some who, you know, we found little traces of anyway. And I was luckily besieged by all kinds of poems when I was there, and this is one of them, Blood and Water. The colour blue was banned for Jews. If any blue china or blue linen was found on them or in their houses, they were arrested immediately. The only colour allowed the Jews was red, and it made them so sad and heightened their anger. A red teapot on a red shelf? Not jolly, aggravating. I said to Ilse, "What did you do about that?" And she said, "We got away with blue because we stuck to the story of not being Jews." As she said it, I could hear all the blue china and glass shattering all over the house. Even the plate her toast was on cracked loudly into smithereens. "Oh," she said, "time for the truth. But we took our not Jewishness all the way to Finchley." All over the house there were cracking, breaking noises while everything spontaneously combusted. "If it's happening here," said Ilse sagely, "how much worse will it be happening in Mainz?" And yes, we turned on the TV and saw the footage. All the blues were turning red. The rivers, the sea, the sky, the flowers. Ilse sighed, exasperated at all the breakage and the waste, and she got out her dustpan and brush and looked at me and said, "This is wrong, and it's all the fault of us Jews." I went to give her a hug and protest at her words, but she shrugged and started crying silently. I wondered if she was going to cry out loud, and if she could, would the world turn all its stupid reds blue again?
Poetry is as strange as exile, it seems sometimes, right? I mean, I think poetry and this kind of figurative language gives us an opportunity to kind of be, what's the word I want? It makes us strange to ourselves for a moment in order to understand something deeper. And that's such the issue, especially with the colors and the blue and the red, is such an unusual approach to thinking about experience and history.
Yeah, I was very surprised by it myself, and I thought it was an interesting idea that it tied in with climate change, you know, the idea of the sky and the sea turning red and being full of fire, and that being anger and aggravation and not peace, and the opposite of peace, and the idea of blue as the colour of peace, which I know that politically the colours are loaded in the opposite direction in America to how they are in England. So I know that we want to change, well, anyway, that's another story, but it's interesting about the symbolism that the poem kind of creates, because I guess I'm working visually all the time. So a lot of my poetry is entirely about swamping language with visuals and creating images that you just see. The language is just a sort of it's just a holding device for seeing something.
Dan, do you have a jump in?
I do. I just want to say it's such a wonderful poem piece, and
Thank you.
the thing that struck me this time is all the layers of noise and silence in it. you know, that the is, what's her name? Is it
Ilsa.
and Ilsa? She keeps trying to, her cover up keeps getting blown by reality, but then it's quite moving how at the end the speaker asks if she could cry out loud, would all these things be reversed? You know, with the,
It's a paradox again, isn't it?
yeah, you know, that
If you don't admit something, the breakage is so much louder. And if you come clean and you tell the truth, then it is a form of mending, and then a form of perhaps of silence or peace. Who knows? We're going to have to do some massive mending after the virus, etc. So, you know, if only this could bring some sort of different version of reality.
Dan, you're last up for your poem. I'm wondering, do you? So two things I want to say. One, do you want to try to put it up on the screen and people can see?
Let's do that. It'll be our one experiment.
Okay, I think that would work well. And then I would also just say that after we finish that, I mean, I have a flotilla of other questions, and there's a lot of comments on the chat. I wonder whether if folks, as they get to the end, if there are specific questions now that they have to either one of you, or about an issue that is kind of connected to our conversation, go ahead and just like phrase that as a question. Either send it to Howard or put it out to everyone.
May I suggest or say something also before Dan reads the last one? If this is so interesting for me, this whole conversation, but it would be lovely if afterwards there was a record, maybe that the poems could just go on the website of the Jewish Learning Center, and that they could, then people who were interested could read the text later and, you know, maybe mull over it if they wanted to. It's so optional.
Yeah, so I've been chatting with my colleagues at the library in Jewish Learning Works about a way that we can figure that out. So I think there's a lot of interest in seeing these afterwards. So we'll figure something out and communicate.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Okay, good. So I'm gonna share my, well, no, I'll say, the thing to know before I introduce this, before I read this poem, is that there's a poem by the medieval Spanish Hebrew poet Shlomo Ibn Gabirol. The poem is Shar Petach Dodi, and that poem is in this long, rich tradition of Jewish poems about exile that are these love poems between Israel and God, and they're written in this often very erotically, full of also longing and loss, as people who's been exiled so much carry so much of, and so you'll see in this poem that the pieces in italics are my translations of this Ibn Gabirol poem that I guess that's all I have time to explain now. So is it up on the screen now?
Whoops. It looks like it's starting up. Let's see.
That's not the poem we wanted, and that's not the poem we wanted. Darn. There we are. Okay.
Oh, here we go.
Great.
Okay, gates. 1, arches. Shar Patach Dodi, he wrote, near the year 1000 in Saragossa, despairing in the citrus and pools of a walled courtyard, his Israel calls, open the gate, my love, get up and open. 8 lines locking like arches around the grief of exile, as in Cordova, the sound of a door leaning into the air, cindered after his people fled the Juderia, his father among them. Open the gate. 2, State Developmental Center, Stockton, California. The smell of the halls, a floor soap only used in the buildings where people are discarded. like a decaying body layered with perfume, vinyl tile flooring, painted concrete block walls, the aggressive scent following us to her ward. A heavy steel door, wire mesh laces the viewing glass, against which, first to respond to the buzzer's abrasion, 2 or 3 of their faces press, wet with drool or mucus, eyes thick, mouths askew. As soon as the orderly with the ring of keys lets us in, they close around us. They talk over each other, repeating their 5 or 2-word stories, trying to meet our eyes. 3. God heard. For my spirit is terrified, is taken with shaking, like grasses in the roadside wind or scarves of kelp winding in tide. God heard the other boys cry, wrote Ibn Gabirol, and wandered to Granada. In deep midnight I am chased by the wild ass, run over by the forest boar. His words would go on, copied, sung, while he lay down on a stone floor, Valencia, asking, please let me out, or into. 4. State Developmental Center. The ward waiting room, wall-mounted televisions, fluorescents, and more of them on shabby couches, staring or shuffling here to there on the checkerboard floor, and her scarred, doughy, patched face, some drained color of sweatsuit hanging bagged on her body, her broken-toothed grin. Her years behind this door or ones like it, brain clogged with the tiny growths, marbled with anticonvulsants, pinned down to one thought of a family 30 years ago, still under one roof. On every visit, my sister asks, when can she come back? 5. Harbor. Open up the gate, my love, get up and open. Saragossa, which sounds like wind in grass or stone walls, mossy, sounds like the ocean's brush on sand. It has charged up the shore, is receding. Okay, I'm going to unshare.
Yeah, this poem is one I've read and heard many times. It's kind of a tour de force, and it's interesting, Dan, what you were saying about home being about relationships and how the idea of relationships are so present in this poem, multiple levels of relationship. Yeah, it's kind of it's a gorgeous, heartbreaking piece. Sophie, do you have any thoughts?
Well, again, I think like all your poems that I've heard, it has this capacity to move between spaces and does that with these very specific tactile and sensory illusions and specificities, like the grass, the moss, the door, the stone, the flesh, the sweatshirt, the sweatpant, the broken tooth grin, that, you know, that the spaces, one ancient and one very contemporary, are how our minds work between spaces, which is why there's such a strength to it, you know, that you're moving between very real, imagined sites. That gives it its power, those two, yeah, the movement, it's like the movement of footsteps or walking or being somewhere. It feels very physical and slow, which I think is a great thing in a poem, in that it slows you down to look inside and look outside, which is obviously the point, you know.
Thank you.
Oh God, I hope I haven't got anything, everybody. We're all at a very safe distance.
I don't know, I'm like 6 inches from you, so I'm not so sure.
No, it's okay, tiny bit dangerous, but yeah.
I was also this is just one of these like nerdy things, but I remember when I found out that the word stanza in Italian actually means room, like a room in a house. And I just thought about that, Dan. I don't have it up, but like the 8 lines of the house, right? There's this idea that the text and the home and the actual building are somehow interconnected in some very deep, almost primal way.
Yeah, I think that physicality that the poem has definitely feels like a built space, and open space too, that the wind moves in and out of these spaces, but that the sort of, the hospital building, the institution, is very enclosed, and you feel that its enclosedness is very precise as well, very, very sort of succinctly drawn, and gives one a sense as a reader that you're now moving into quite an enclosed space, quite claustrophobic and difficult. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I never thought about that. I must have been really longing for outdoor spaces to balance. Yeah. So here we are, Dan, with almost no time left for questions.
Oh no, we have plenty of time. Plenty of time. We had talked before, right? We wanted to curtail our conversation sufficiently, and I've been kind of watching the chat, and I'm seeing a lot of comments, a lot of fantastically positive reflections. I'm not seeing an enormous number of like specific questions about, please tell me the answer to this, but there are a few of them. And so one question, there's a couple here about color. Sophie, maybe I will address this to you, or Dan, please jump in also, about blue and red, and the Jew connections to history and Jews. And I just had in the back of my mind, I just pulled out that the painter Barnett Newman had this obsession with a certain kind of blue that he associated with an ancient biblical something that no longer exists, and that blue has been lost to history, and it's an exile. There's something. Does that ring a bell to you, Sophie? Does that story?
That story does ring a little bit of a bell. I'll have to look that up. I think that for me, as a painter and person who's just looked at paintings and art all my life, basically all the colours really, really excite me, but for completely different subjective reasons at all times and in all contexts, because obviously colour works as to what it's next to, and the world is entirely made out of colours just butted up next to each other very closely, and you can't really see where the divisions are, but believe me, that's what the world's made out of. And for me, I suppose blue is this extraordinary thing which is space, and the fact that Yves Klein tried to copyright his blue is not really, it's the case that those Buddhas in Afghanistan that were destroyed, that were made of blue, that might have been lapis lazuli, I'm not sure because I don't want to get this wrong, but apparently there are caves in Afghanistan where the lapis lazuli is so strong it can blind you, and the idea of being blinded by a very rich blue seems like quite a good way to go in terms of our current health preoccupations. And I've got lapis lazuli on, and I inherited these from my mum, and so they have a special significance, whether that's because it's not got nothing to do much with her being Jewish, but to do with her being a colorist herself, because she was a textile designer and obviously a massive influence on me and where I make the work I do. So I don't know about Jewishness and color symbolism. I just think color is something that is an endless source of fascination and joy and aliveness. Yeah. And also that, I guess in exile, people who are running away might grab their nearest scarf or quilt, and when they get somewhere they might start stitching something new out of it, or finding some new rags, and that rags are obviously rags and Jewishness are very much going hand in hand, and that I have this sort of rag trade inheritance. So, and I've printed my own dress, so this is kind of all part of a very long story. I don't even know where to begin or end it, so I'll just end it. Park it now.
We'll have another conversation about color and visuals in exile sometime soon. I'm just looking at a couple other questions. Right. Well, this is a response about Dan, about the last poem, The Gates, and about the virus, and about hospitals and hallways, and how I know that you wrote this before that, but there is a way in which when we write something that speaks to people from whatever situation they're in, whatever historical moment, there often is something valuable to take from that.
Well, I saw that comment too, and the thing I'm thinking about that is actually a thread that ties my poem together with Sophie's last poem that she read is that exile is about is an experience of profound vulnerability, and home is home is connected with safety, or that's what we hope for it, right? And yes, we're in a time where we feel we're vulnerable in a way that that we have not experienced. We're vulnerable in the way that some of the figures in these poems are writing about, are making concrete.
There's one species of question that I had maybe wanted to bring in, and I don't know if we have time to open it up too much, but I feel like the way in which both of you write about the natural world in different ways is kind of striking to me. And the fact that when we think about our home and exile from a home, we can't not think about climate change. There's a few kind of comments about that also on the chat, and it's a whole nother level of feeling vulnerable, right? To sense that where do we go, if anywhere? And I'm wondering how both of you might how do you look? This is the question. How do you look to the natural world in terms of being at home, and in what way do you feel? How is home in the natural world connected to your work or your being?
I think for me, it's as big as the question about colour. In that, the world we really literally do live in is animated by certain things that you learn to rely on. And, the colour and the nature are very similar for me. They're incredibly sustaining. I mean, like humour, in relationships, these things are our sustenance. And one of the things that's blown me away about being in Berkeley is the colour and the light. It's like, this has set me off on a whole lot of new paintings and made me connect with nature in a new way, a new phase. And in fact, while I'm looking, as well as looking at the computer, I can see out of the window, and a blue jay arrived on the little tree in my garden while Dan was reading. And his poem was also kind of lit up by the blue on the wings of the jay. It was another dimension. And yeah, I want to write about it, and I have been writing a lot more about nature and the climate than I used to, because it's very urgent. And I suppose it's heartening that people are taking action, and that the heartening side of this virus is that we can see that people can work collectively, and that's made me feel optimistic about something changing. And I want very much that nature can lead this change. And I've been totally blown away by nature here, and being able to get inside a redwood tree and see that the redwood builds on what damages it to create new life, new layers, new growth, and that its growing is dependent on being struck by fire and disaster and plague. That makes it big.
I'm wondering whether maybe we'll have like this last question to both of you from my end, and then we will thank and say goodbye to everybody.
Can I answer that previous question, or are you moving on?
Please, you must.
Oh, sure.
I was assuming that this is my last chance to talk, so I have a tidy little masterpiece of comments to deliver to,
Great. Let it roll
to the Zoomy masses out there. So yes, I've been writing a lot about that. I think in a way everyone I know is, because one of the functions of being a poet and writing poetry is to have your antenna out, and that's the overwhelmingly urgent issue for all of us, is the world, and we our exile is a thing which is done, people are forced into exile by, they're compelled into it, and we in a way have compelled our land and our planet into a certain kind of exile, and we live in various states of exile from it, so that's the second thought. The third thought is, as a Jewish people, we, for better or worse, we are good at nursing hopes.
Are we?
Nursing precious hopes over long periods, even if we're discouraged about them, and we've treasured and nursed our hope of being able to come home to our own land. And I think now what that means is a coming home of our human species to a right relationship with our lands. And my last thought is that one of the great pieces, I think, of film that I've ever seen is the credit sequence for WALL-E, the Pixar movie WALL-E, in which, that movie, from, just in case you don't remember, is about a world that's been so violated and trashed that it's a big garbage dump that humans have left. And they come back at the end because the little WALL-E has communicated that the robot, that it's safe to come back, and they come back. And then over the credit sequence, they restore the earth. And with this beautiful Peter Gabriel song playing, and the credit sequence also recapitulates the history of art. It's just a masterpiece, and it's a good image of what's still possible. Thank you for letting me get all that in.
No, fantastic. Something happened to my screen, so I'm kind of in the dark here, and maybe that's what happens in exile. But if you all can see me still, I'll keep talking. And
I can see you.
Okay, maybe I'm going to use this opportunity to do two things. One, to thank Dan and Sophie so much for kind of coming together kind of at the last minute to help put together this conversation, and everyone who joined us. And I hope this was an interesting and useful conversation that managed to both be organized and streamlined and give you a chance to participate in at least some ways. It's not exactly the same as being in the same room, so I appreciate your patience. And I'm wondering whether, Howard, if you are available, whether there's any last thing you wanted to say or any final words of wisdom or farewell.
Sure. Well, first of all, I just want to thank you, Sophie, Dan, and Dan, for really giving us a wonderful afternoon. I think as our worlds become smaller, experiences like these just get greater importance for us. So I have a lot of gratitude towards all three of you, especially at such short notice. I do want to tell everybody, we will do our best to get the texts that were read today. And the easiest way, I will send something to anybody who registered. And if you did not, if you could just put your email in the chat, I'll grab that and I will send the texts to you once I get them from Sophie and Dan. And thanks again. We're going to have a talk with Dan Schifrin next Sunday at 2 o'clock. Go to www.jewishcommunitylibrary.org for all of our upcoming events, and those will increase and multiply. And for those who won't be joining us, I want to wish you all a wonderful Pesach.
Great. Thanks everybody. Take care. Stay safe.